Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Father 𝐏𝐫𝐶 𝐆𝐥𝐞𝐧𝐝 and I am the chaplain for the Aquinas Institute for Catholic Life at Princeton University. Besides having Mass on campus each day and meeting the sacramental and pastoral needs of our community, we also like to offer things to nourish the mind. And tonight we're offering our final lecture in our Faith and Culture series, where we've had a lecture this semester about literature, one on medicine, and tonight on international law and human rights. And so I would like to invite our Director of Academic Programming, Dr. Marcus Gibson, to come to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Father Zach. And as he said, my name is Marcus Gibson, for those of you who don't yet know me, and together with Father Zach, and on behalf of the Aquinas Institute, I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening. We'd like to thank also the James Madison Program for co-sponsoring tonight's event, and thanks also to the Politics Department and to the University Center for Human Values for supporting the event as well. Well, welcome this evening to our third and final lecture for the semester in our speaker series here at the Aquinas Institute. Our topic this evening is a momentous one, the Universal Human Rights Project, its history and its future prospects. And we have the wonderful opportunity to be exploring this issue with two distinguished professors this evening. Let me introduce you to them briefly now. First, our speaker for the evening, Professor Mary Ann Glendon, is the Learned Hand Professor of Law Emerita at Harvard University and a former U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See. Professor Glendon has served as chair of the U.S. State Department Commission on Unalienable Rights, as a member of the Commission on International Religious Freedom, and as a member of the U.S. President's Council on Bioethics. In 1995, she led the Vatican delegation to Beijing for the UN's World Conference on Women, becoming the first woman ever to lead a Vatican delegation. Her work includes The Forum and the Tower, a series of biographical essays exploring the relation between political philosophy and politics in action, Traditions in Turmoil, a collection of essays on law, culture, and human rights, and A World Made New, Eleanor Roosevelt and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a history of the framing of the Universal Declaration. After Professor Glendon's remarks, we'll hear a response from Professor Stephen Macedo. Professor Macedo is the Lawrence Rockefeller Professor of Politics at the University Center for Human Values at Princeton, as well as a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Academy of Sciences and Letters. Professor Macedo is also past president of the American Society for Political and Legal Philosophy. Most recently, his book, In COVID's Wake, How Our Politics Failed Us, co-authored with Princeton professor Francis Lee, examines institutional dysfunction and elite failures during and after the pandemic. His other works include Just Married, Diversity and Distrust, and Liberal Virtues, among many others. Macedo's research spans liberalism, democracy, civic education, and globalization, and Professor Macedo has founded Princeton's program in law and public affairs, leading efforts such as the Princeton Principles on Universal Jurisdiction. Now, having welcomed our two speakers for this evening, please join me in welcoming to the podium Professor Glendon.
Thank you, Professor Gibson, for that kind introduction, and thank all of you for being here on short notice. And also, I know it's a busy time in the academic year. My topic for tonight, as you heard, is some reflections on the current state of the ambitious post-World War II International Human Rights Project. And when Father Joe and I discussed the topic for this lecture many months ago, I thought it would be timely because we're in a period where relations among states are changing rapidly, even more so in the months that have passed. And as of Good Friday this year, there was an announcement from the State Department that makes it even more timely because the State Department has announced coming changes in which it will substantially alter its approach to human rights and foreign policy. So let me begin with what exactly I mean by the term International Human Rights Project. With that term, I'm going to be referring to the idea that took hold after World War II, that there ought to be some kind of very basic common standard by which nations could judge their own conduct, agree to be judged by others, and that idea took hold, but only after a very difficult beginning. It found expression in the document that you may be somewhat familiar with. In 1948, it found expression in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, by which nearly every nation in the world agreed to, let's say, if they didn't agree to be bound, it's a non-binding document, but they agreed to recognize. And some parts of that document were later designated as non-derogable. Those are rights that are considered by a 1966 covenant to be especially egregious. Now, I have one other preliminary remark, and that takes the form of a disclosure, although it was mentioned in the introduction that I chaired a State Department commission on human rights in 2019 and 2020. And that commission, I should say, was composed of Republicans and Democrats and independents like myself, but we all shared a dedication to international human rights and to the belief that the United States has historically championed human rights and foreign policy, and we ended our report with these words. The United States, by virtue of the principles deeply inscribed in its constitutional system and in its international commitments, must champion vigorously the vision that it and nearly every other nation pledged to support when they approved the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, we made that statement with full understanding that many factors go into foreign policy besides the promotion of human rights. But at the same time, we felt that in that moment, 2019, 2020, it was observable that the world's liberal democracies were decreasingly emphasizing human rights when it came into competition with something else. So we thought the moment was right for what the Secretary asked us to do, review foreign policy and the way human rights have been handled, and try to articulate suggestions for a principled approach that would both advance American interests and respect American values. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is begin by recalling the difficulty there was in getting that idea accepted and established in 1948. You have to keep in mind that before 1948, it was widely understood in international legal circles that how a nation treats its own citizens is pretty much the business of that nation. So it wasn't all that easy to alter that understanding. I'd like to move from the difficult birth of the project to the achievements of the 1980s that surprised so many, especially the skeptics, then to what many human rights advocates are now acknowledging as its current crisis, and then turning finally to the question of whether and how it might be revived. So when I go to a lecture, I like to have a little outline of what the speaker is going to say, so that sometimes just so I can see how close they're getting to the end, but also it's kind of nice to keep track along the way. So starting with the beginnings, let me ask you to travel back in your imaginations to the moment in May 1945. The war in Europe was ending, and the Allied powers were getting together to plan for a new post-war order. Today, it's widely assumed that the impulse for international human rights standard of some sort, it's widely assumed that it had its origins in the dismay and horror at the death and destruction that took place during World War II. And that was certainly a factor. But the story is more complicated, and I think more instructive. during World War II, there had been calls here and there for an international standard of human rights. They called it then an International Bill of Rights, but human rights were not even on the agenda when the leaders of the Big Five got together to plan for the new peace and security organization that would be called the United Nations. And you won't be surprised when you think about it. After all, two of them, France and Britain, were presiding over large colonial empires. And in the United States, racial segregation was legal in many states, and the Soviet Union had its own reasons for not wanting any outside scrutiny of how it treated its own citizens. But though they weren't paying attention to it when they were planning the post-war order, the lack of a common standard posed a great dilemma for them, a real problem when it came to the question of how they were going to treat the principal German and Japanese leaders. Where was the standard by which those people would be judged? And in the way, the reason that was the problem is that there was widely thought to be a formal principle of justice. Indeed, it's one of the non-derogables in the current international system, that no one can be convicted for an act that was not a crime at the time that it was committed. Nullum crimen sine lege. So defenders of the trial said, so we're in the Aquinas Institute. So Aquinas first frequently said contra, but on the other hand, there were defenders of the trial who ultimately prevailed, and they argued that the trials themselves would provide the standard. But that's just what made the prominent jurists very uneasy. So Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time, Harlan Fiske-Stone, he called the Nuremberg trials, even after they were completed, he called them a high-tech lynching. Have you heard that expression before? Yeah, Clarence Thomas used it in his nomination hearings. But the first user was Harlan Fiske-Stone. A high-tech lynching, he said, and sanctimonious nonsense. Then a judge in my hometown, Boston, Charles Wyzanski, a Jewish judge, wrote an article in the Atlantic magazine where he warned, this kind of trial sets a dangerous precedent. Nullum crimen sine lege. Now, again, since we're in the Aquinas Institute, maybe some of you are thinking, well, what about natural law? And there were a few voices that were raised saying, well, they violated natural law, but you can guess what the international lawyers said about that. Nobody agrees what its content is, or even whether it exists. So the trials went forward, as you know, but the concerns lingered. There was a certain uneasiness, and as a result, I mean, one good result of could argue many, but one good result was it speeded up work on the 1948 Genocide Convention, which now makes criminal all the most egregious kinds of conduct that were involved in the Nuremberg trials. So that was that, but what about a broader standard of human rights? There are lots of other values, principles that are included in most national bills of rights, charters of rights. Could there be an international standard of some principles that could be accepted as a common standard? But the path to that was much more difficult. First of all, there was the disinterest on the part of the Allies, which I mentioned. Political realists in the international law establishment dismissed the idea. And then there was the American Association of Anthropologists. Some of you may have read the books we read in college, some of us, Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict and Franz Boas, and they were all telling us that about the great differences there are among all different parts of humanity, and not much emphasis by the anthropologists on common humanity. So there was a lot of static about the idea of an international standard. Where then could it possibly have come from? And how is it possible that standard was so far ahead of its time in 1945. Equal rights for men and women, where did that come? Equal rights for nations large and small, where did that come? Well, here's what happened. The Allies, after they settled everything about the new UN that was important to them, they called what they called a founding conference in San Francisco. And they invited representatives of 50 nations to come to the conference. And among those nations were many who came from what used to be called small nations, by which was meant not small in size, but relatively small in influence. And many of those representatives from the so-called small nations got together, and they had their own ideas about what would be important in the new UN. The mood in that group, as we see in their letters and speeches, was very much, it exemplified a phenomenon that Max Weber had described after World War I. Weber said that war on a vast scale unsettles settled ways of living to the point where a general sense begins to emerge that the way things have always been are not necessarily the way things always have to be. And so these representatives, these newcomers to the founding conference of the UN, they formed a coalition. And their coalition was it was demanding that the Allied powers live up to their war rhetoric, which did talk about human rights. Churchill and Roosevelt had said, what we're fighting for better standards of life and larger freedom. Well, they got nowhere with that until they managed to get support of the one country that was open to their ideas. And that, of course, was the United States, where Harry Truman had just become president. And with the powerful backing of the United States, they got 7 references to human rights in the UN Charter, including a provision for the establishment of a Commission of Human Rights, and that commission, as its first task, took up the preparation of a Declaration of Human Rights. And 3 years later, in 1948, Eleanor Roosevelt, let's see if I can do this. Yes, Eleanor Roosevelt presented the finished document to the United Nations. And as you can see here in the text, she wanted to emphasize 2 things. She was hoping for a unanimous vote, and she got it. There were abstentions. I'll say a bit about that in a moment. But she emphasized 2 things. One, pay attention to the fact, to the character of this document. It is not a statement of law. It doesn't legally oblige you to do anything. It's a charter, and notice the terminology here. The document says Declaration of Rights, but she says, twice she says it in that speech, it's a document of principles about rights. And that turns out to be very important and very related to her emphasis to the non-legally binding character of the document. So, as I mentioned, there were no dissenting votes. It was unanimous in that sense, but there were 8 abstentions: Saudi Arabia, South Africa, and the 6-member Soviet bloc. But I would still argue that the vote without dissents was an impressive political accomplishment because it was evidence that there are some things so terrible that nobody openly wants to approve them, and some things so good that nobody openly wants to oppose them. The consensus that was established in 1948, again to the surprise of the international lawyers, it grew rapidly. Newly decolonized nations, as they entered the UN, signed it. Some modeled their own bills of rights after it. And the consensus continued to gather force over the next several years until the 1980s, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights became the most prominent symbol and indeed provided the vocabulary for the great grassroots movements that were able to end apartheid in South Africa and lead to the collapse of the seemingly indestructible at the time regimes, totalitarian regimes in Eastern Europe. And even today, the Declaration still provides the principal reference points for cross-national discussions of human rights and the principal vocabulary for those discussions. Which brings me to the question of how to explain the current erosion of consensus on the very basic set of principles that were, at least the framers of the UDHR thought they were sufficiently grounded in the world's cultural, philosophical, and religious systems to be called universal. Today, even longtime human rights advocates are starting to express second thoughts and doubts about the movement to which they have devoted much of their lives. In the book called The Debasement of Human Rights, Aaron Rhodes, former director of the Helsinki Federation of Human Rights, he says, and I quote, "The movement to which I devoted much of my life has lost its essential meaning and moral power." Stephen Hopgood, University of London, titles his book The End Times of Human Rights and says we are living in the end times of human rights. My friend Rusty Reno, the editor of First Things magazine, wrote an article saying he was against human rights, even though years before the magazine had warmly endorsed the Declaration. I wrote an answer to that if you're interested. And Samuel Moyne at Yale University has written, quote, "All signs point to a crisis not just for human rights, for the human rights movement." So what's going on? Certainly it isn't that human rights violations have diminished, far from it. Latest surveys show that they are at new high levels in many parts of the world. Torture, arbitrary arrest and imprisonment, crackdowns on freedom of religion, the non-derogables, still very high rates of violation. So how can one explain the current disillusion? I would say there were some stages, some of them based on honest mistakes, some of them based on political opportunism, some of them based on pure power politics, but I would name as the first one when the Soviet Union finally started to at least give lip service to the Universal Declaration. The two major powers during the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union, in a certain sense tore the Declaration in half, in the sense that the United States paid almost exclusive attention to the political and civil rights, and the Soviet Union, at least verbally, paid almost exclusive attention to the social and economic rights. This is my original artwork here. So what they did, ignoring the fact that the Declaration of Human Rights has explicit language stating that the rights it contains are interdependent with one another, indivisible from one another, that freedom is dependent on certain conditions that are necessary for the exercise of freedom. They just ignored that. Okay, but it had a consequence for later on because they set the stage for later human rights advocates, some of them with the best of intentions, but ignoring the integrated structure of the Declaration, they set the stage for a kind of deconstruction of the Declaration. Again, my original artwork. So it ends up that today, I think it's widely, the Declaration is widely treated, even in the human rights community itself, as a kind of a la carte menu. Then, I would say the next stage was the 1980s, after the great successes, the great achievements of the 1980s. There's a sense in which the Declaration became a victim of its own success. What I mean by that is that there was an explosion of human rights activity. Established organizations started looking for new causes to promote. New organizations grew up devoted to various causes. And there was a period of, I would say, calls to make everything from free access to the internet to free university education to make that a universal right. Now, I have to just digress for a minute and say that the framers of the Declaration never for a minute thought that it was a closed catalog. They didn't think this was the last word. But what they did think is that in order to be called universal, a proposed right would have to be able to gather support, broad enough to be called universal. And that's why they avoided pronouncing on one of the big controversies of their day, capital punishment. They said, there's not going to be agreement on this in the foreseeable future. They did contemplate that as time went on, new understandings would evolve, and from the bottom up, some things that were not universal rights could become it. But for them, it was a bottom-up process. What happened in the 1990s, especially at UN conferences, is that population control advocates and abortion rights advocates tried to jump the gun on that bottom-up process and get some things established at international rights before they were accepted by many countries as rights at the national level. And when those efforts didn't succeed at the UN conferences, nevertheless, many Western-funded groups kept using the language of human rights to promote ideas that had not actually been made human rights. And that led to what I would say was another factor in the growing disillusion, which was resentment in many parts of the world of ideas that were being proposed or imposed in the name of human rights. They would sometimes call them Western ideas, but there was that resentment gathering in parts of the world. And then another factor was disenchantment with some international agencies that had the responsibility for promoting human rights or protecting human rights, namely the UN Human Rights Council and the International Criminal Court, which have been credibly charged with bias. And in the case of the HRC, because of UN rules about membership, it sometimes happens that some of the world's worst human rights violators are taking their turn on that commission, which doesn't actually help. So you can see why, when you add to all that, when you add the fact, and the one that concerns me most as an American, when you add the fact that the liberal democracies, even countries with strong national rights traditions, seemingly are decreasing their promotion of human rights in foreign policy, you can see why many human rights defenders, advocates, are saying their movement is in crisis. Which brings me to the question of whether the Human Rights Project can be saved. Now, I'm a hopeful person, but you might think that what I'm going to say is not really, it's a little dark, but anyway. One thing I would say is certain. The enemies of free societies are hoping that the answer is no, it can't be saved. And I think it would be reckless to say yes. But I do feel confident in saying I think the chances to revive it would be increased if human rights defenders would recall 4 largely forgotten elements of the wisdom of their predecessors. And the first one is simply this, that the number of principles that people of vastly different cultures will accept as a common standard is relatively modest. That's why the framers of the Declaration intentionally limited themselves, and it was largely due to the relative modesty of their document that it achieved the international reach that it did. Second point was universality of principles does not, and indeed cannot, mean uniformity. I think Catholics get that point better than most human rights advocates because we understand, as a worldwide religion, we have a rather small core of principles. the Apostles' Creed, a few other things, small core principles that can legitimately be brought to life in different societies in ways that are pleasingly different. So, Catholics kind of instinctively get that, but a lot of people still like the top-down idea. Okay. Having said that, I have to add a third point that the framers knew very well, that just as uniformity, just as universality cannot mean uniformity, pluralism cannot descend into cultural relativism. It doesn't mean, because there are somewhat different ways of bringing the principles to life, it doesn't mean all bets are off. And then finally, there's the principle of subsidiarity, which first found expression, as you know, in Catholic social thought, and is now explicit in international law. It's explicit in international law, but I think international lawyers don't fully understand what it means. They still like top-down. But the subsidiarity principle emphasizes, as you know, the primacy of the lowest level that can do the job. And in the case of the Universal Declaration, the framers thought, and the proclamation of the Universal Declaration recites, that the nation states are the front level. The nation states, if the nation states can't do the job, then there is room for international action. Now, I can't complain that I can't maintain that observing those four, or recalling those four elements of the original approach, I can't claim that that would revive the Human Rights Project. But I do believe it would improve the chances for renewed attention to the areas where the Human Rights Project had its greatest successes in the past, and where there is still a lot of work to be done. Now, how does the outlook seem? Honestly, I have to say that where the most powerful nations in the world are concerned, I think it looks pretty dim. There are some countries, like China, that really openly dismiss the idea of, or at least challenge the idea of political and civil rights in the name of economic and social principles. And even countries, as I mentioned, with strong national rights traditions are increasingly hesitant about supporting human rights in their foreign policy. But interestingly, just as in 1945, the strongest support for the International Human Rights Project is among nations and political groups that by themselves do not exert much power and influence, although together they could. And I have one example here. I'm thinking particularly of a remarkable collaboration between the world's largest organization of political parties. It's called Centrist Democrat International. It was formerly called Christian Democrat International. And this centrist organization is based mainly in Europe and Latin America. And the other organization, which really needs to be better known in the West, is the world's largest Muslim organization. It has 100 million members, and it promotes a form of Islam that embraces pluralism, religious freedom, abandons the idea of a caliphate, declares itself a foe of radical Islam. There are many other ways in which you could describe it, but it is, maybe most interesting of all to this audience, that its project is to reform Islam using the approach of Vatican II. And I've been asked to lecture to them on Vatican II, and I have to say, well, yeah, but it's a cautionary tale because you had different reactions to Vatican II. The hermeneutic of rupture, the hermeneutic of continuity, and so on. But how interesting that they explicitly name the Vatican II effort is something they want to do. And by that they mean, look at what the core principles of the faith are, and then see where historical excrescences, cultural elements have entered in that are not part of the core, and even kind of in contrast to the core. So I think when they say they like Vatican II, I think what they see as the most dramatic part of Vatican II is the change on anti-Semitism. And I think that's where they see that there's something they need to know better. And it's quite remarkable. So anyway, to get back to the two big organizations, they have formed another organization called the Center for Shared Civilizational Values, and they have declared, in a formal joint statement, they've declared their support for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I've got to quote this, as, quote, a set of principles that still can serve as a common standard for all nations. So I do see a little glimmer of hope there. I don't want to overstate the importance of that collaboration, but I do think it's plausible that renewal of the Human Rights Project could originate, as it did in 1945, in what Pope Francis called the peripheries, but I don't, as in 1945, I don't think it will get very far unless it can attract the support of the nation that has the longest history of support for human rights principles, namely the United States. Which brings me to the recent news about the State Department's intentions concerning its human rights reports and its proposed reshaping of departments with responsibilities involving human rights. Now, I mentioned the report that the commission I chaired issued in 2020, and I'll start by saying that my hope would be that the State Department changes would be guided by the recommendations of our report. Namely, that the United States should resume its historic role as champion of fundamental freedoms and develop a principled approach that would promote American interests while reflecting American ideals. But I have to say, I haven't seen any signs of that happening under either the previous or the present administration. Said contra, I do think it is a good idea to review the State Department's annual human rights reports, because if you compare the State Department's annual human rights reports with the reports of another federal commission, the Commission for International Religious Freedom, you can see that the State Department for quite a long time has been skimping on religious freedom, and then that is I would say, fortified by a report that was issued by the House Foreign Relations Committee in December. The report shows that the State Department has actually been taking funds that were appropriated by Congress for the promotion of religious freedom, and not only appropriating them for other causes, but even appropriating them to organizations that fight religious freedom. So I think that in those areas, there are some fixes to be done, but meanwhile, coming back to the recommendations of our report, there is a great need, maybe one of the most important ways in which the United States can promote human rights in the world, and has promoted human rights in the world, is the power of example. And on that, I'd like to quote just one more sentence from our 2020 report, where we said, "It must be recognized that the American model will serve as an inspiration to others only so long as we ourselves recognize the gap between our principles and the imperfections of our politics, and can demonstrate, as we ask of others, tangible efforts and improvements." Now, I realize that I haven't painted a very rosy picture this far, so I'd like to conclude with some thoughts why I believe the Human Rights Project is worth saving. I gave a lecture about human rights in Poland recently, and Ryszard Legutko, who's a Catholic writer on human rights that I greatly respect, he said he's through with human rights. They have been completely misappropriated, and they're so distorted that he has just no use for them anymore. And I say, well, why let the bad guys have all the good words? But that's a serious argument that is going on in Catholic sectors, is disappointment in the misuse of human rights. So I have to say something about sort of thing that I say to people like Professor 𝐏𝐫𝐶𝐽. And I think it's good to remember some of the good things that the Human Rights Project does even today, right now, in all of its distress. Most nations do go to great lengths to avoid being blacklisted as notorious human rights violators. And most really horrible violations of human rights do come to public attention. But as for more than that, well, it's worth remembering, I think, that the men and women who framed and who had the idea for the Human Rights Project had seen the worst of humanity. They'd seen things that are worse than probably most of us have seen. But they took encouragement from the fact that while human beings are capable of great evil, they are also capable of imagining better ways to live. They're capable of imagining, for example, that there are rights, and of articulating those rights in declarations and constitutions, and orienting their conduct toward those norms that they've recognized, and of making excuses when they fail to observe them. The only alternative really is the will of the stronger. There's a sculpture outside the UN building in New York. Maybe some of you have seen this. My daughter, the art historian, doesn't think too much of it. You don't either? It's a gift from Italy to the United Nations. And you may be thinking it's not very nice to give somebody a present that's already broken. And I have no idea about why Italy gave that, but I think it is very appropriate. I'm glad that it's outside the United Nations. As you can see, it's a beautiful, rotating. It's got actually a device at the bottom, so it rotates. So it kind of makes you think of the globe. And yet, there's something dreadfully wrong with it. It's cracked. And maybe it's cracked because it's defective. That's possible. Or maybe it's cracked because, like an egg, it has to be cracked in order for something else to come out. And indeed, there is something in there, another golden sphere that seems to be emerging, but that one's cracked too. So I think I can say in this audience, makes you think of original sin. So there, in spite of everything, there's this sense of motion, of dynamism, of emergent possibilities. And I think that's how it's been with the Human Rights Project. Yes, it's flawed. Yes, dreadful violations still occur, but it has inspired large numbers of men and women to try to do something about it, even though they know that their efforts, too, will be less than perfect. So I'm thus inclined to say about the Universal Declaration what Abraham Lincoln said about the Declaration of Independence. It is a bulwark against tyrants, and ever will be, so long as it is not brought into contempt by its pretended friends. Thank you.
Please give your attention now to Professor Macedo for his response.
Well, thank you to the Aquinas Institute, and thank you to Marianne Glendon for visiting us here in our New Jersey backwater. It's a great pleasure to comment on this talk. I'm not an expert on human rights. I pointed that out when I was invited to do this. And the other liability I have as a commentator is that I agree with Professor Glendon on pretty much everything. I read the 2020 report hoping to find points of disagreement, but I need to keep searching. But in any case,
you're the only person who read it.
They should read it, and everyone should read it. I think it's a very nice document, and I'll say a couple things about it here. So, can the Human Rights Project be saved? I certainly hope so. That project seems to me, on the whole, as Professor Glendon has said, a great achievement, and one that Professor Glendon has illuminated. But this is 2025, and nothing can be taken for granted. And one of the most striking and interesting features of Professor Glendon's account in her book, The Talk, and in the 2020 report, is the extent to which she casts the Universal Declaration as a successor document to the great charters of rights and moral principles of the American political tradition, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the post-Civil War amendments, and also the basic principled commitments of the New Deal and the Roosevelt presidency. That, of course, focuses our attention as Americans on a related question to whether the Human Rights Project can survive. Can the American Constitutional Project, which helped to inform this international document and project, can that survive? And I tend to think that if the American Constitutional Project can be saved as something recognizably worthy of our allegiance, then the Human Rights Project will also have a fighting chance, at least. But as Professor Glendon has alluded to in Washington, D.C. at the moment, there's a strong sense that national sovereignty, our power and interests are best served by going it alone and as she just alluded to, the will of the stronger, ignoring or even despising our international commitments and withdrawing from them. And certainly many of these international bodies are deeply flawed. In my work on the COVID pandemic, we saw that the World Health Organization made lots of mistakes and very bad calls. The Scottish epidemiologist Mark Woolhouse makes the point that the World Health Organization got every important point wrong in 2020 concerning the COVID pandemic. But nevertheless, I'm strongly of the view that our participation in these international institutions, including human rights bodies, on the whole enhances our domestic constitutional commitments. And so let me dwell as a moment on the interrelation between these two projects, which Professor Glendon has done quite a lot to explore. The mutual supportiveness of the American Constitutional Project and the International Human Rights Project. One theme in Professor Glendon's work is that the International Human Rights Project actually helped us overcome, or it itself overcame, some of the limitations of our 18th century Constitution, which was guided principally by classical liberal ideas. Professor Glendon evidently approves of the ways in which the Universal Declaration also drew on European constitutional traditions, owing to Rousseau and others, with a stronger and clearer role for social and economic rights, and the idea that the state has positive duties of social provision to ensure a decent life for all citizens as a matter of fundamental constitutional principle. Now, these mandates were legislative mandates, not to be enforced by courts for the most part, but she nevertheless, in both the 2020 report, which was criticized for having too much emphasis on property rights, I find that rather surprising, given what it says about Franklin Roosevelt and the social rights and so on. But it's very striking when, to read back through her work in our highly polarized time, to read what she has to say about not just Eleanor Roosevelt, who we know she holds in high esteem, but also Franklin Roosevelt, who is featured as well as wielding a fundamental influence over the Declaration, the Declaration's contents, the Universal Declaration's context. FDR's call for a second Bill of Rights, which again sought recognition of the social and economic rights. And these had, according to the 2020 report, close analogies in the 1948 Declaration, including the rights to a useful and remunerative job, the right of every family to a decent home, to adequate medical care, to protection from economic fears of old age, and so on. And there was also, as she alluded to a moment ago, FDR's insistence in the Atlantic Charter, setting out the principles that should guide the Allied war efforts in World War II, that the peoples of the world should have rights to free collective self-determination, something he insisted on over the vehement objections of Winston Churchill, who was presiding over a colonial empire that he sought to restore after the war. These principled commitments and war aims in opposition to colonial domination played a role, were invoked by Indian nationalists and others subsequent to World War II and during World War II. The current administration in Washington would do well to be reminded of the importance of respect for the sovereignty and self-determination of other states, both small and large, even as small as Greenland. So in reading Professor Glendon's work, I'm struck in both of these ways by the recognition of positive as well as negative rights, to put it very crudely, and in support of principles of self-determination against colonial and other forms of domination. And the evident thought is that international commitments and declarations can help clarify, expand, and strengthen our own domestic moral commitments, as it were, so that participating in a wider global conversation about human rights and basic principles may improve our own understanding and performance at the domestic level, something I've tended to sympathize with myself. So there's another feature of the Universal Declaration and the Human Rights Project that Professor Glendon highlights in her work, and she did in her talk, and it furnishes another useful lesson for both sides in our deeply divided political community. And that is her stress on the fact that the basic moral standards, the basic principles of the Universal Declaration were meant to be bridges across the ideological and cultural divides of the world's reasonable peoples, cultures, and traditions, to use somewhat Rawlsian language, and that to gain broad acceptance, to function as common moral touchstones for mankind, common global norms, these principles had to be modest in scope. To play the role of a kind of global public reason, they had to have sufficient buy-in and support from the diversity of the peoples of the world, with a wide variety of cultures and practices. And that meant leaving aside some matters that people on the left or people on the right or elsewhere on the spectrum regard as fundamental matters of political justice, but which could not yet function as common global norms. And this is evident in this aspect of the Universal Declaration, is in a way the need for political moderation and self-restraint, even moral self-restraint, in order to find common ground and achieve some urgent purposes, moral and practical purposes, along with those with whom we disagree on many matters, to achieve some modest but urgent moral aims. Now, in spite of that, the Universal Declaration of 1948 was progressive in some important respects, as she's mentioned. Equal rights of nations to self-determination, also women's equality. Quoting the 2020 Commission report, the Universal Declaration held that the legal liabilities based on sex were incompatible with a dedication to unalienable rights. And that, in that respect, its embrace of equal rights without regard to race or religion, the Universal Declaration advanced, as the Commission report puts it, the unfinished business of America's own founding documents. So while there were these progressive elements, and it's impressive that the delegates from around the world were willing to endorse them in 1948, a crucial precondition of the Universal Declaration's success was that it leaves aside issues that particular groups regard as requirements of full justice, but which are not yet sufficiently widely supported to form an appropriate part of these global standards. And that admonition to recognize that some of what we regard as required by justice should not be insisted on as a precondition of respectful cooperation, so important in 1948 and in the international context, remains valid in our own time and in our domestic context. When it's so important for moderate and reasonable liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, and independents to prioritize the most basic common principles of our constitutional order, the integrity of elections, the powers of the rule of law, judicial independence, checks and balances, respecting the powers of Congress and independent agencies, and so on. So the 2020 Commission report, so again, I think that this emphasis on remembering the importance of the common ground we can share if we exercise some restraint, some moral self-restraint, is quite important. Now, the 2020 Commission report on unalienable rights came in for a fair amount of criticism in saying that certain matters were inappropriate subjects to have included in 2020 and an international human rights instrument. And it named specifically abortion, affirmative action, capital punishment, and same-sex marriage. And the criticisms were gathered by a group called the United Nations Association, and the criticisms were signed on to by the American Civil Liberties Union, Amnesty International, the Anti-Defamation League, the Center for American Progress, Human Rights Watch, a bunch of Columbia law clinics, Planned Parenthood, and so on. The critics said, and I quote, the 2020 report makes a deeply disturbing distinction between unalienable rights and what it describes as the social and political controversies of abortion, affirmative action, and same-sex marriage, and also capital punishment. And I'd be curious to hear what others in the audience think about that bracketing in 2020 as things that would be premature, at least, to include in an international instrument. But I have to say that it seems to me salutary, as I said, to be reminded that in fashioning the moral basis of our common lives together, whether as a global society of peoples or as citizens of a large and diverse democracy, such as the United States, it would be unreasonable and wrong to hold out for recognition and acceptance of everything we might think to be required by justice and fairness if it will impede practical convergence on even more urgent values, such as I said, domestically at least, the rule of law, judicial independence, separation of powers, and the constitutional guarantees that are crucial to our survival as a constitutional republic. So while I personally look forward to a day when same-sex marriage, for example, or civil marriage equality gains greater global acceptance, as it has done in the United States, and also I would personally judge the right to an abortion in the early stages of a pregnancy, I do not find Professor Glendon's cautionary notes on these scores at all unreasonable. Shoring up the common ground of international human rights, and indeed shoring up domestically the common ground of our constitutional basics, is the most urgent thing we face as citizens, I think, of the world and citizens of our constitutional republic. Over time, there will be incremental expansion, recognition of new human rights, as there has been in the past. There are progressive dimensions that were recognized in the 1948 report. But we also need to be patient and to recognize, and I'll close on this note, the virtues of political moderation and comedy of the sort that Professor Glendon has found in the 1948 document, that I think is exemplified in her 2020 Commission report in spite of the critics, and of the sort that we really need in our constitutional politics today. So I will end on that note.
Cito, and we have some time now for question and answer with our speakers. We have staff on hand and 2 free mics available, so please raise your hand if you have a question, and one of our staff will bring the microphone to you.
I wanted to ask Professor Glendon about the universal principles behind the universal human rights, and were there theological influences on those principles, or were those principles promoted by publicly religious people, somebody like a Jacques Maritain?
Could you speak a little more slowly?
Okay. Are there theological principles for the universal human rights which are perhaps no longer considered to be as common? I teach at the Princeton Theological Seminary, and there are some faculty and maybe many students who would not affirm the Nicene Creed as universal for Christians, much less a basis upon which to develop universal rights. They would actually call that a colonial project. So my question is, were there historically theological principles or religious public intellectuals promoting the Declaration of Human Rights? And is the future of the project dependent upon a clear theological articulation of the image of God, the conscience, John Henry Newman's idea of the conscience? Are those theological ideas required for this movement that you're talking about? Were they in the past necessary, and are they necessary today?
I can answer your question with one word, but I'd like to say more than one word. The answer is no. The principal drafters of the Universal Declaration came from vastly different traditions, the Declaration has been criticized by Pope John the 23rd and Pope John Paul II and many, many philosophers and theologians for something that is missing from it, and that is foundations. And it's true, as John Paul II said, that the Declaration does not have philosophical or theological or anthropological foundations. But here was the wager that the framers made, because they were serious people and they knew the problem of foundations was there. But on the very first day, the very first meeting, the 2 philosophers in the group, Charles Malik and Peng Tong-Chang, who was a Confucian philosopher, they said, wait a minute, how can we draft a Universal Declaration of Human Rights if we don't settle why people have rights? And Mrs. 𝐏𝐿𝐴 from India said, "We are not going to get bogged down in those subjects. We're here to draft a declaration. We got a job to do." And the subject never came up again. But it did come up in a UNESCO commission. And here's what Jacques Maritain and his colleagues concluded. They said, "We think," here's the wager, "we think that the principles in this declaration do have foundations in the sense that foundations can be found in most of the world's philosophical, religious, and cultural traditions. They will not be the same foundations, and it's not all the traditions. It wouldn't be found in the tradition of nihilism, for example, but they wagered that foundations could be found, and I think that is what the collaboration that I mentioned at the end of my talk between the world's largest Muslim political organization and the centrist Democratic Association, I think that's what they wager, and that's what they've said in their joint resolution, that these principles can still be valid for the world's diverse traditions.
Can I just add to that? I think that's a really important point, that there are plural foundations. We don't have to insist on the same foundations.
I think of it like a table. You know, like the table, it's many legs.
Yeah. Again, John Rawls does exactly this with his political liberalism and in his account of international justice, accept the plurality of reasonable traditions that overlap, an overlapping consensus on these shared moral commitments.
And what's the alternative?
Yeah, what's the alternative?
Because, you know, and Thucydides tells us about the Athenians came down to Melos, and the Melians, poor little island conquered by the Athenians, and the Melians are saying, "But what about justice?" And the Athenians, you know, we all love the Athenians, but our friends, the Athenians, say, "Right is only a question between equals in power. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." That's the alternative.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Glendon and Professor 𝐏𝐫𝐸. That's really great. And I'm wondering, thinking back to Professor Glendon's earlier work, there's a book called Rights Talk that you wrote, I think, in 1990,
Yep.
to date myself, but anyway. And you argued there about the United States constitutional experiment, right? That we have focused too much on rights discourse and not enough on sociality and responsibility. And like you and Professor 𝐏𝐫𝐸, I'm very strongly in favor of human rights and the importance of rights. Also, Professor 𝐏𝐫𝐸 wrote a book, Liberal Virtues, right? So we have these other dimensions of political life. And I'm wondering if either of you thinks the crisis of universal human rights might also be related to a lack of a sense of responsibility equal to talking about rights. And yeah, anything about rights, virtues, responsibility, or sociality.
I love that question. You know, I've often thought that much of the controversy about the social and economic rights could have been avoided if they had taken the suggestion of the Chinese philosopher who was on the Human Rights Commission, and he said, "Oh, we ought to have duties here. We have all of our draft sections begin with everyone has the right to, everyone has the right to." And he said we should talk about the corresponding responsibilities that go along with those rights. And the French person who was in charge of form and style, who was the person who knew all about drafting documents, said, "Oh no, we'll put duties in the end. We won't put it in all the articles because we want them all to look the same. So we'll put duties in Article 29, where, as it turns out, nobody pays attention to reading the document as a whole." And really it is implicit in the document that everything that's called a right there is accompanied by a responsibility. And you're right that I did say, I have an expression I like to use about the language of human rights is that, like other languages, it's spoken in different dialects. And I think the American dialect is very, I would say libertarian, but I don't want that connotations of that word, but I would say it's very much more focused on individual freedom, whereas the continental European dialect of human rights is focused also on the responsibilities one has as a member of the community. And one of the things I really like about the Universal Declaration is, I would say, it brings together the two halves of the divided soul of liberalism, our love of individual freedom and our sense of being part of a community for which we all bear a common responsibility. And the challenge for us in our commission, when we were explicitly told to ground our support for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the American constitutional tradition, we had to work a little bit to bring out those aspects of the American tradition, which I think we can be proud of our country and say they're there, and they're as strong as anywhere else in the world, but they're not explicit in our founding document.
Bruce Ackerman describes the New Deal era as a kind of informal amending moment, but it doesn't have the same formality as the original founding or the post-Civil War amendments.
And,
You do a great job, I think, highlighting its importance.
And I would say, if you look at the founding and look at what was going on in towns and cities and the very decentralized aspect of the founding, that you can find that sense of responsibility and community. I would say we had it in our formative period as much as any country in the world.
Absolutely. And Tocqueville talks about it in the 1830s when he's visiting, and they're very prominent parts of the American political practice at that point. It's a very tough thing. I'm a political scientist, and everybody recognizes the dire straits that we're in as a political community, deeply divided, polarized. People hate one another across the political divide. There's so little to be said by political science about what would actually improve the situation. And it's also, civic education is something that people are deeply concerned about. There's not a lot of hugely interesting political science on that. I think Putnam's stuff on social capital and the importance of religious communities and other communities. Eleanor Roosevelt used the language small spaces where these virtues and values are nurtured. But those things are all waning in the United States today. Church attendance, participation in groups of all kinds, the civic texture of our society has weakened considerably.
I very much appreciate what Professor Macedo said at the beginning of his remarks, that in a way, when we talk about can the Human Rights Project be saved, I think what gives many of us a feeling of deep concern is that there's really a question of whether the American democratic experiment can be held together.
Thank you very much, Professor Glendon and Professor Macedo. So this question could be for either of you, but maybe more for Professor Glendon. I come to this as an outsider, so my question is fairly broad. It seems to me countries could sign off on the UN Declaration and on contemporary human rights statements, and they could try to stay off the list of human rights abusers in 1950 or 2020 for two reasons. One, because it's in their interest. Two, because they actually believe in those human rights. So to what extent do non-Westerners sign off on human rights statements and try to stay off the blacklists out of self-interest? And to what extent do they do so out of conviction? And I guess the question matters because to the extent that it's self-interest, not conviction, the rights aren't universal, except in the opinions of some. And I'll close by saying that, to me, the notion of individual rights smells a bit Western. And if China or even Spain had driven the human rights process from the beginning, rather than the United States at the absolute apogee of its geopolitical power, a universal declaration, if one had emerged at all, would have looked very different.
Well, like individual human beings, countries rarely act from one motive. And it's not always easy to discern what is conviction and what is self-interest. One of the reasons I feel concern and regret about our own situation and our own democratic experiment is that it's been constitutive of our political makeup that we thought it was in our self-interest to be a model, to be the best we could. And the whole point of our 2020 report really was to try to reach into the cultural manifold of what we've got here and say, this was what we once held ourselves up to be, and for self-interest reasons as well as conviction, this is what we ought to be presenting to the world.
I would add to that, yes, I completely agree. But, again, when Tocqueville talked about the civic activity of Americans, it was based partly on enlightened self-interest. The idea was that acting on some of these duties to other members of our community, participating with them in various kinds of civic activities, would redound to a certain kind of enlightened self-interest, being a fair cooperator, being seen to fairly cooperate with others in international society or domestic society, and developing a good reputation for being an ethical actor, maybe on the global stage. There are aspects of self-interest there, but there can also be ethical aspects as well. So I do think sort of mixed motives can play a. But when you read, we look back on actually, there's a very good biography of FDR called "Traitor to His Class" by H.W. Brands, and we think of FDR as a great political campaigner and speech maker, with the cigarette kind of cocked back in his mouth and so on, but he really had, some moral insights that he was concerned about, and that's a book that really kind of gives you greater admiration for FDR. And even just with political leaders, one of the excellent books about the founding generation is by Douglas Adair called "Fame and the Founding Fathers," and this was true of Lincoln too, I think, as well. That sometimes people's moral motivations are partly a matter of being thought well of and being regarded as a great leader, in human history. Immortal fame, comes to those who are great benefactors of their political societies. George Washington's name is on every street in America, and we probably had that, and we probably realized that in some ways. And it really is a kind of you mentioned the nihilist traditions, but Rudy Giuliani was asked, about 10 years ago, "Don't you care how history will remember you?" And his response was, "No, I'll be dead." I mean, which is pretty horrible. What do you say to that? So I think there are these kinds of mixed motives, but and actually, Tocqueville said about Americans, they don't like talking about civic virtue and so on and these things, but they actually act on them. So I do think that's one difference between the European tradition and the American tradition. It's easy to talk about these virtues and to vocalize them a lot, but whether people actually act on them is a different question. And the Chinese, when those brave students stood up against the tanks in Tiananmen Square, they also had erected a model of a Statue of Liberty, hadn't they, in Tiananmen Square? They found the American principles. I've been to Vietnam, and there are comic books for children about Abraham Lincoln in Vietnamese, sold in ordinary stores. So I'm not so sure about the wide gaps in these traditions. I think the human rights kind of framework, the idea that there are certain kinds of abuses by states that are of concern to people everywhere, torture, that torture is wrong, that genocide is wrong. I don't think that's particularly Western. Once people make sense of it in their own language and so on. And there has to be this particularity in the way these general norms are interpreted and applied and so on. So that's a long-winded, answer, but it's a good question.
Sorry, we'll go here real quick.
I wonder whether the real answer to the question of is there a disenchantment with, is there a loss of faith in the human rights project, universal human rights project? Really the issue that Professor Glendon alluded to when she, a moment ago, talked about the United States going through a phase of walking away from the so-called democratic experiment, in which we are certainly deeply embroiled right now. And we have had in the past very active human rights grassroots constituencies. Indeed, the very fact that the language about human rights entered into the Charter was because of Virginia Gildersleeve and other human rights NGO types who were at the UN Charter Conference. And it struck me as perhaps limiting that in Professor Glendon's discussion, the focus was strictly on the adoption of the Declaration of Human Rights. Forgive, do I do better with this away from me? Because
maybe a little bit further.
Okay. Because it has been for 40 years an elaboration not as simply hortatory, but in international law and international commitments, when the charter, where the declaration provisions were then translated into international covenants on civil and political rights, to which countries accepted a legal obligation and for which they accepted a responsibility to report to other states. So we've had this elaboration of legal obligations and monitoring mechanisms. Do you see those as in jeopardy? Yeah, we're in a period now where either a junior Bush administration or a Trump administration walks out of the Human Rights Council. We don't want to be judged by these people, and that turns their backs on an international criminal court. But other American administrations of a different persuasion reaffirm those. And the Europeans and the Latin Americans are, it seems, the one bastion of international commitment that will endure when the United States sides with Xi Jinping and Putin briefly. Don't we really have hopes that in the end, this ship can come back into port?
Well, there's a lot in that question. Regarding the covenants, yes, to the part of your comments where you asked, do I view the covenants as in jeopardy? Well, yes. I think the whole international rights apparatus is in jeopardy. You mentioned several elements of it. It's not only the principles in the Universal Declaration, but the covenants, some of which have been signed, some of which have not. The United States doesn't sign every international document, but on the other hand, the United States, when it signs something, usually, rule of law being still a pretty big part of our makeup, the United States thinks long and hard about making a commitment through a covenant, whereas a lot of people just sign everything and ignore it. But I do think the whole apparatus, the international human rights apparatus, is currently, people are losing confidence in it. And it may be, when you get down to regional human rights treaties, that sometimes by trying to do too much, you end up not being able to do the good that you can do. And I think that's the situation right now with the Strasbourg Court. That if you start to micromanage everything in every European state, you're going to get a big blowback.
Or just one more question before we draw to the end of our time.
Well, that's a heavy burden on me, I suppose. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk, and it's so interesting to see the two of you together from your different perspectives. I was at a recent talk by Professor Macedo about COVID, in COVID's wake, to cite his book, and how our politics have failed us. And I took from that talk a critique of the elites of our society, who maybe have not led so well and thus have caused disenchantment in certain institutions. And Professor Glendon, you mentioned this in terms of the disenchantment with the United Nations as an agency, maybe the ICC as well. My question is very focused on that particular point, which is, at least to a layman like myself, when I think about the International Human Rights Project, I inevitably think about the UN as the enabling, dare I say, the enforcing agency, if you like. But it seems to me that over time, there's been great disenchantment, at least in this country, with the United Nations as an institution. And could you just elaborate on that point, if you believe that to be the case? And I'd be interested to hear Professor 𝐏𝐫𝐨𝐼 talk about that, since he also has a particular perspective on the disenchantment with institutions.
Well, that's a big subject. Gosh, I mean, the disenchantment is real, and I think the UN has brought a good deal of it upon itself, but part of it is structural. I think there are things they didn't think about when they were putting it all together there in San Francisco. Like, we talked a little bit about the UN Human Rights Council, which has just been so spectacularly blind to horrible human rights violations in some places and overzealous in other places. It's the rules of the UN require certain membership arrangements so that it comes to be the turn of some of the world's worst human rights violators to be on the Human Rights Commission. There's need for maybe a little restructuring, except it's hard to see how that would ever happen.
I'm not an expert on the United Nations. In my case, it seems that the educated elites, in part for various reasons, but are a bit out of touch with the interests of ordinary people on various kinds of issues. And I worry about that, and partly in university institutions too. I think that we're a bit out of touch with concerns of ordinary people. The balance of views in our faculties is quite different from the balance of views in societies. There's no reason to expect those things to match up, but if they pull apart sufficiently, then we're not serving our role as taking seriously the range of concerns that are concerns to ordinary people outside universities. So I do worry about the division of the cultures of educated elite institutions and those ordinary citizens.
I can't imagine what you're talking about.
Just fill in the details.
Well, much more could be said, to be sure. Unfortunately, we're at the end of our official time together this evening, but we do thank you for joining us. We hope you'll continue to participate in the conversation, both informally and at other events from the Aquinas Institute exploring these questions. But for now, please join me in thanking our speakers.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you doing that.
I'm just sorry I couldn't find